Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
What was India like 300 to 1,000 years ago, a time when the Persianate and the Sanskritic worlds interacted and clashed in a variety of ways? Professor Richard Eaton of the University of Arizona joins us today to discuss his masterful work, India and the Persianate Age, year 1000 to 1765. Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath, and Richard, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you so much.
This is the most recent of 5 books that Richard has written on India between the 11th and the 18th centuries, and has a much larger corpus of scholarly work as well. Anchoring our discussion today is Professor Prashant Keshavmurthy from the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University in Montreal, who is a scholar of Persian literature and a lot more. Prashant, welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And over to you, Prashant. The floor is yours.
And Richard, congratulations on yet another marvelous book. I so enjoyed this. Maybe I could begin by asking you a general question, which is, could you perhaps tell us why and how you came to write this book now rather than earlier in your career? I ask this because it's apparent how you draw throughout your book on the most current art historical, architecture historical, literary historical, and social historical scholarship to build your arguments. So would it be right to say that you could only have written this book now rather than earlier? Or would it have been a different book maybe 10 years ago?
Well, okay, why did I write the book now? And why did I not write it earlier? That's rather simple to answer. This work really is a culmination of a lot of thinking that I've been doing over the years about India. As was just remarked, I've written about 3 or 4 other books preceding this, monographs. Penguin approached me about writing a textbook covering India's so-called middle period to follow chronologically Romola Tupper's Penguin history of early India down to 1300. Well, after I finished drafting this book, I was asked at a dinner party by an innocent participant at the dinner party. She said, well, Dick, what is the argument of your book? I never thought I had an argument in this book. And I thought of it as a textbook, and I didn't think that textbooks properly really had an argument as opposed to a monograph. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there actually was an argument. And that argument had to do with the need to rethink a very long and contentious period conventionally called the Muslim era of Indian history. Even though my first several monographs and a couple of edited volumes were explicitly about Islam, over the past decade, I have grown more skeptical and more critical about the continued use of religion as a principal marker that would characterize this long period. And that's really addresses your question as to why this book came out now. Part of it has to do with my dismay over how medieval Indian history has been politicized, even demonized. I mean, Prime Minister Modi, for example, refers to this period as 1,200 years of slavery. That's actually his term. And such rhetoric, I think, has very unfortunate consequences. More importantly, I came to realize that this emphasis, this sort of approach, is really anachronistic. Because to a great extent, the use of religion as kind of the defining lens through which we see this period of India's history can be understood as a back projection of 20th century political history. You think of the Indian nationalist movement, the Congress League opposition, the Pakistan movement, the partition of 1947, not to mention 3 wars. But when you actually examine the period on its own terms, one does not really see evidence of modern communalism or anything quite like that. While, of course, there is religious identity and religious alterity, naturally. But what we would today call religious were not necessarily understood in such terms by contemporary actors. So just a couple of examples out of the book. I mean, the word Sharia, today we think rather exclusively means Islamic law. But in as recently as the period of Aurangzeb's reign, it simply meant law, or more accurately, legal. Many more non-Muslims than Muslims use the Sharia and the courts of Ghazis, since that's the place where you went to resolve conflicts, register documents, and so forth. Or again, going all the way back to the Ghaznavid period, or the Ghordid periods of the 12th, 13th centuries, Sanskrit inscriptions referring to the Ghurids and the Ghaznavids typically called them Turushka, or Turk. They did not identify them by their religion. Or in the 16th century, in the 17th century, if you go down to the Deccan plateau, there was a popular preference for the use of Vijayanagara's ancient gold coins, the Hun, by Muslims as well as Hindus across the Deccan plateau. And these were coins that had Sanskrit lettering on them and Hindu deities and all the rest of it. These were preferred even by officials at mosques and other Muslim institutions, preferred them to the kinds of coins that were issued by Bijapur or Ahmednagar that did not have those kinds of markings on them. In other words, there was a preference for an older, traditional type of coin that went back all the way to the Chalukyas of Kalyana, back to the 12th century. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if religion then was not going to be the kind of basics or the organizing principle of this book, then I had to ask the question, what would do that, right? And this is where I got interested in the argument by Shelley Pollock, his whole notion of the Sanskrit cosmopolis. I saw extraordinary parallels between what Pollock was trying to do, referring to the period roughly the 4th century for another 1,000 years, and what began in the 11th or 12th century, which could be properly called a Persian cosmopolis. I began to think of literary and language schools and means of discourse as a possibly more fruitful way of thinking about this long period of India's past, rather than the tired old trope of Hindu-Muslim encounter, if not conflict. So that's one point. And then I'll just very quickly mention that the other reason this book could only have been written in the last couple of years is because of my own interest in the use of biography as a historical method. This is something I explored in a book, The Social History of the Deccan, which was exclusively concerned with biography. And I became aware of the extraordinary power of biography as a rhetorical tool in narrating history. In a nutshell, those were some of the reasons why this book could only have been written in the last 4 or 5 years.
So if I may follow up on that, I have questions on both of the broad points you've made, the idea of the cosmopolis, the Persian cosmopolis, as well as the use of biography. I'll start with the first. Now, we see across the book the Samanid origin ideal of the sultanate, the Mongol ideal of world empire, and Sanskritic ideas of the polity as a mandala, sort of intermeshing across the book. So, for example, even as small scale a case as 15th century Mandu, a Sultanate of Malwa, we see Sultan Mahmud Shah, as you describe him, creating a mandala, a circle of kings, by leveraging the military labor market, the availability of elephants in eastern India, and by expanding his territory by exploiting what you call inter-household conflicts among enemies. This is just one small-scale example. We have other examples as well across. And we see an intermeshing of Persianate and Sanskritic ideas, of statehood, of polity. And both in this book and in your previous book, Power Architecture Memory, that you co-authored with Philip Waggoner, your argument for what you call the Persian cosmopolis depends, like Sheldon Pollock's idea of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, on arguing, as I understand, that this was a religion-neutral idea of royal justice, as you just described. If I may just sort of press you on that, could there not be said to have been religious limits to such religion neutrality? For example, how do we make sense of the fact that when you discuss the Bengal Sultan, Raja Ganesh's son Jadu was allowed to rule Bengal only by converting to Islam as Sultan Jalaluddin? Or if one takes literary ideological resources into account, take, for example, the Persian Alexander romance as a tradition stretching from Nizami right down to Amir Khusro and past him. Why is it that the world conqueror Alexander, both in Nizami's two-part version of his life in the 12th century, late 12th, early 13th century, and in Amir Khusro's version, Oine Iskandari, the Alexandrian mirror, which he completed in Alauddin Khalji's court in 1301, both of these cases Alexander is presented as virtuous partly because he sets fire to Zoroastrian fire temples and humbles pagan Greek philosophers like Plato. For example, in Amir Khusro's version, he floods pagan Greece because it's atheist, or because the Persian poem calls mulhid. It's full of philosophers who deny that the world was created. They believe in the eternity of the world. And they also deny prophecy, as do the Brahmins of India. And it's only by humbling the Brahmins of India into submitting to prophecy, not necessarily converting to Islam, but submitting to the reality of prophecy, and by setting fire to the Zoroastrian fire temples, that Alexander comes to be valorized as a virtuous king. You speak of the global circulation of the Alexander romance. So in other words, monotheism, in the case of Amir Khusro, an early Chishtiya humbling of peripatetic philosophy of falsafa, and the necessity of prophecy and the finality of Muhammad's prophecy are constitutive of Alexander's royal education in Nizami and Khusro. So are these not, in a way, limits to cosmopolitanism, or might we say these are just literary rhetoric which has little to do with the sheer pragmatism with which social relations were actually conducted?
I think my initial response would be that the word cosmopolis is an extraordinarily capacious term that does not necessarily exclude religion. It's impossible to imagine, for example, the flourishing of Persian in India without the extraordinary impact of Sufism and Sufi literature and the entire tradition that of course, comes with that. So I by no means intend to convey the impression that this is somehow a non-religious enterprise that we have here. But what I do wish to say is that there is a component to this idea of the Persian cosmopolis which tones down to, I think, a great extent, the role of religion. And I try to illustrate that, for example, by simply the use of coinage, for example, in the 16th, 17th century Deccan, where clearly, the question of whether Hindu deities appear or do not appear on a coin was not material to at least the ordinary people. And I think here's another question. We come into issues of class. I mean, who are the consumers out there? And it seems to me that when we're talking about the cosmopolis, we need to bear in mind the fact that this is something which all people are participating in, not just those who are literate in Arabic or in Sanskrit. There is an important dialogue between not only the Sanskrit and the Persian language traditions, but also a dialogue between both of them and the vernacular population, the vernacular world. Indeed, this is a very important component of the idea of a cosmopolis, is the sense that even though a tradition may originate in Persian or Sanskrit, they can become translated into vernacular tongues. And in this way, they filter down to a common population, which is not necessarily at all obsessed with the niceties of religious distinctions. The advantage of using a term like cosmopolis, because it allows you to see how religion, far from being excluded, is something which can participate in this larger vessel. If you think of it in terms of a metaphor, the idea of a cosmopolis can be seen as a carrier or a vessel for a wide range of phenomena, certainly including the Alexander romance in the various ways that you just described. But it's the interaction between the linguistic and literary fields that I find to be most interesting. And that's what I tried to focus on in the book.
Perhaps one of the absences that enabled this culture of living with a religious difference was the absence of what we today call a public sphere, for whatever that concept is worth, originating in Habermas. But, so for example, I'm going to read just a little passage from page 220, if you want to follow me, of your book, of the Indian edition, which is the chapter entitled The Consolidation of Mughal Rule. And you speak very interestingly here of Hada Rajput chieftain called Surjan, and who submitted, like most of the other Rajput houses, to Akbar. And you say here, quote, consider the surrender of the fort of Ranthambore by the Hada Rajput chieftain Surjan in 1569. A miniature painting in the Akbarnama, the official chronicle of the emperor's reign, shows Surjan submissively bowing down to a seated Akbar, guided by a court servant. In the accompanying text, the chronicle's author, Abul Fazl, boasts of how easily the fort had fallen, comparing Akbar's feat with that of Alauddin Khilji, who had captured it in 1301. By contrast, a nearly contemporary Sanskrit biography of Surjan portrays Akbar as having been so pleased with Surjan's courageous conduct that he offered him 3 territories in return for the single fort, suggesting that the siege's outcome had actually been a victory for the Rajput chieftain. Unquote. This kind of mutual appropriation of each by the other for the self's own local purposes is arguably possible because there is no public sphere. For example, there is no textbook. History was not a discipline as such taught in schools. It was institutionally mediated. But today, for example, there is a contest over textbooks, which is sort of the site of the context over what the national past ought to be. But there was no national past. There wasn't even a people's past then. There were just multiple community pasts. And because there was no lowest common denominator public sphere kind of site, each community could appropriate events and kingship for itself so that Akbar could become Rama-like for the Rajputs. He could become a Rajput kinsman, whereas the Rajputs were absorbed into an equivalent Timurid pattern of kinship and so forth. This is just speculation. Was it the absence, in a way, of a shared public sphere that allowed such a hierarchized and yet easy interlocking perspectivalism?
Yes, I would agree with that. The example you just showed, mentioned, I think is right to that point. That is to say that when Surjan Singh submitted to Akbar, clearly they both saw that in different terms, and they could live with that. And since there was no public sphere, there was no radio station or TV or internet that broadcast to the non-literate public what had just happened, everyone could kind of imagine it in their own terms. And to a certain extent, continue to live in their own worlds. I think another parallel would be with Man Singh, when he has, and I think somewhere in the book I quote him as well, issuing these bilingual inscriptions. And it's interesting, the Persian inscription will say, for example, the context is very simple. He's dedicating a fortress that he's finished building. And the Persian text will glorify Akbar, and it will simply mention in passing that Man Singh happened to do this. And the text in Sanskrit, or perhaps it's in Hindi, I can't remember, will really give all the credit to Man Singh and make only passing reference to Akbar. And I think you're right that they could do this and they could get away with that kind of thing precisely because there is no public sphere that would get in the way of that.
And there's also no discipline of history correcting what we might today call alternative facts.
Yes, or fake news.
Or fake news, exactly. I guess everyone got along wonderfully because they could produce community-specific fake news. I'm being facetious, but...
Exactly.
To another point that you brought up earlier, one of the leitmotifs of your book, which makes it so enjoyable to read, as also the earlier book you mentioned built on biographies of lives in the Deccan, is how you cut between systemic considerations, for example, like geography, the importance of the sedimentation of the Gangetic Delta, to the unplanned Islamization of Bengal, Eastern Bengal, or economics, for example, the interconnectedness of the Spanish invasions of the Americas and the higher velocity of precious metal circulation in Mughal domains. These kinds of systemic considerations and individual psychology and action. So, for example, Muhammad Tughlaq's mercurial disposition, or Humayun's addiction to courtly pleasures, Akbar's shrewdness, or what you call Aurangzeb's obsessively industrious character and his fear that his sons would do to him what he had done to his own father, and so forth, Tarabai's machinations. How do you understand the interplay of individual and system? Do you have a kind of a historiographical or meta-historical theory in mind, or is it just something you worked out without necessarily theorizing it?
It occurred to me as I'm writing it, and now that you asked the question, there's necessarily an interplay between individuals and systems or systemic phenomena. History is really not comprehensible without understanding those underlying systems, such as the ones you just mentioned. The role of silver, the larger import of silver into India from the Americas, and how that interacted with the expansion of a agrarian frontier in Bengal, that kind of thing. But at the same time, it's individuals who actually create these systems or are embedded in the systems in some way or another. Indeed, that was the whole approach that I used when I wrote my social history of the Deccan, 8 Indian Lives. The social history part of it was really about systems, whereas the 8 Indian Lives part of it was all about biography. And my attempt there was to raise issues like military slavery, using Malik Ambar as an example, or social banditry, using Papadu, this Robin Hood-like character, as an example, and so forth. In writing that book, I became aware of the power of biography and how it can be used strategically by historians. It seems to me that people are inherently fascinated with the lives of other people. But ever since the mid-19th century, biography as a historiographical method or approach has been largely shunned by the academic establishment. University presses publish relatively few biographies, whereas commercial presses thrive on them. Right now, 6 of the top best-selling nonfiction books on the New York Times list are either biographical or autobiographical, and all of them are published by commercial presses. So I think of biography as a strategy that needs to be used. But of course, when you're writing a history as long as 1,000 years of all of India, you clearly cannot devote all that much to individual lives. And I had to be very sparing when I did so. So that's why I chose, for example, I did get very extravagant with Aurangzeb, devoting an entire chapter to him. But that was only because he is such an extraordinarily controversial and misunderstood and at the same time significant figure. I just felt I had to. That's why I used a series of vignettes in order to mention him.
That's one of the features that makes your book gripping to read, because there's a kind of traditional, almost popular aspect to it, while not being completely popular, because in a way I see you as returning to what was a focus of social science conversations in the 1980s, which is the debate over structure and agency. That's what they would have called it then. And you return to that without replicating the hagiographical, biographical tendencies of the Persian sources themselves, which tend to present the royal actor as a kind of fount of all significant events other than God. You don't do that, of course, because you set individual action within systemic considerations that these Persian and other sources wouldn't themselves have conceived of. Maybe that's a good point at which to pose a related question about the nature of individuality in Persianate India, because I know that's been a concern of yours, in earlier books as well. When we consider that, for example, Sultan Balban was bought, if I recall, as a slave, as a young boy, with a group of other boys, Central Asian boys, and recruited into North India. And Sunil Kumar discusses in The Emergence of the Delhi Sultanate, he doesn't quite speak of individuality, but he does speak of the problem with what it meant to be a Delhi Sultan, which is that you struck out as a sultan from among a peer group who rightly questioned your pretenses to being a sultan because they were your equals until yesterday. And you came from nowhere, as in you were a slave bought as a boy. It seems to me that although he doesn't spell out the connection, but it's tempting to think that the bid to become a sultan must have had something to do, or must have sort of gained encouragement from Persian literature of the period, some of which, like Khalil Abdullah, celebrated individual exertion.
Well, that's entirely possible. That's a line of reasoning I did not pursue, but it's a fascinating question to think about. I mean, certainly when I was thinking about the 12th and 13th centuries and the rise of military slavery, one theme that came out very clearly to me was this tension between the Persianate preference for the purity of blood, whole idea of proper descent. Dynasties are built on this, royal families, aristocracies, and all the rest of it, versus the prioritizing of loyalty for its own sake, which is, of course, what slaves are all about. There's a famous proverb or statement that comes out of the Siyasatnameh of Nizam-ul-Mulk that a sultan would vastly prefer one loyal slave to 14 or 15 sons, all of whom simply want to inherit the throne. So that kind of tension is there. And Sunil Kumar talks a lot about this. I think it's one of the more interesting aspects of what he does in that book is to think about how the Persian chroniclers, who are steeped in this Persianate sense of the purity of blood and so forth, are really at odds with the idea of loyalty, which is the basis of military slavery. And that interplay is something that works out throughout the entire so-called slave dynasty period. Of course, it was not a dynasty. That's the whole point. It was a succession of slaves, many of whom tried to start a dynasty, including Balban, but failed. Iltutmish is another one. So that question of individuality, the question of loyalty and the purity of blood is absolutely front and central, it seems to me, in trying to make sense of this period before the Khaljis and the Tughlaqs even appear.
One of the most valuable lessons I think South Asians, especially those outside academia, could learn from your book is that social identities in public discourse in India are taken as primordial, for example, Rajput, Sikh, Maratha, were in fact roughly datable products of conjunctures of imperial power and the military labor markets. That, for example, it was only by the late 16th century that Rajput became what sociologists would today call an ascriptive identity, which is to say an endogamous birth identity rather than one could adopt by undertaking military service, which, as I take you to be saying, was the case in the 11th century. You could only be born a Rajput, you couldn't become one, whereas you could become one in the 11th century. And that was, of course, a product of interactions with the Mughal state. Mughal emperor got to decide succession, Rajput succession, Rajput houses, which in turn necessitated bards producing genealogies and so forth. So this is one of the remarkable features of your book, how identities like Maratha and Rajput and Sikh were in fact products of very specific conjunctures. In this connection, I want to ask you if you could perhaps tell us how and whether this early modern crystallization of caste identities, Purabiya Rajput, for example, through the military labor market differed significantly from earlier and other caste formations. Was there something specific to early modern communal and caste formations that was rather different, let's say, to what Romila Thapar and others might tell us about pre-Islamic or, let's say, late ancient community formations?
The idea of a military labor market that was widely discussed ever since the 90s when Derek Kolff talked about this in his book, Nowakar, Rajput, and Sepoy. That idea, I think, is a very fruitful way of thinking about the formation of all sorts of identities, not just caste identity, ethnic identity, linguistic identity, religious identity. So what we're really talking about here is trying to historicize this idea, historicizing communities that are commonly thought of as primordial. One of the things that I wanted to kind of feature in this book, because it seems to me that one of the many tensions that runs through Indian discourse today is this idea of primordial identities. And I thought this would be an opportunity to discuss exactly how far back can we trace some of these identities and how do they appear. Kolff's argument, very simply put, is that a lot of it depended on who happened to be your recruiter. If you were recruited by an Afghan commander or Amir, you would end up thinking of yourself as Afghan. Or if it was a Rajput, then you end up being a Rajput. And what's interesting is that this kind of thing, although it's difficult to find a beginning point of it, it continued far down in time in history. Kolff himself mentions that as recently as World War I, when Hindu landholders were being enlisted in the British Indian Army, many of them became Sikhs merely by the act of enlisting, because that was the dominant kind of cultural discourse there. He quotes a British recruiting officer in the Punjab as noting, quote, "It was an almost daily occurrence for, say, Ram Chand, a Hindu, to enter our office and then leave our office as Ram Singh, a Sikh recruit." That really captured my attention because it speaks to the staying power of the institution of military recruitment as something that was itself constituting or helping to constitute and contribute to people's identities. So Kolff traces this back at least to the 15th century. He has a lot to say about Sher Shah, for example, in the 16th century in eastern India, as well as the Sultan of Malwa and the Rajput houses, all this happening then. The 16th century is also the period that Cynthia Talbot talks about in her own recent book, discussing the Prithviraj Raso, a late 16th century vernacular text, which celebrates the loser of the Battle of 1192 when Muhammad of Ghor defeated Prithviraj. Well, Prithviraj comes out in this text as not only a hero, but so also do his own commanders, who are all seen as descended from, or rather, the commanders were seen as the ancestors of the Rajputs of Akbar's own day. So that, in other words, in a sense, that text contributed powerfully to creating an idea of a collective Rajput aristocratic lineages, which were characterized by chivalry and courage and martial prowess and all the rest of it, but a closed category, socially speaking, as opposed to an open one that had been there before that time. And the same is true of the Marathas. The same is largely true of the Sikhs. But your question has to do with whether this differed significantly from earlier caste formations. And I guess my answer here has to be that I don't think we really know. I'm not sure it's possible to answer that question because the first horizon of when we get text referring to this recruitment process of Sher Shah or of the Marathas in the Deccan who were recruited by sultans of Ahmednagar and Bijapur, that's when they became Marathas in a sense, and so forth. The first we really hear of that I'm aware of is in the 15th and 16th centuries. Since the military labor market obviously existed, if not forever, at least for a long time before the 15th century, I think it's reasonable to assume that that dynamic had been in operation and working well before the 16th century, simply that we cannot document it so far as I'm aware.
May I back that up with a question that will seem simple-minded, but I think is important because it's a question that gets posed in this form in conversations I had or was privy to growing up in India, which is that, Islam is an egalitarian religion and yet hasn't seemed to have done much for caste hierarchies and so forth. And, reading you and reading Koff and others on the military labor market and it's important for caste formations and so forth, it strikes me that, like Sumit Guha has argued recently in his book on caste, that Muslim kingship of various sorts in South Asia, it leveraged already existing community and caste hierarchies and endogamies and patriarchies and so forth to build itself. Muslim power, no differently from Hindu power or Sikh power and other kinds of, imperial formations in South Asia. Let's say Muslim kingship was isomorphic in its relation to caste and community, isomorphic with non-Muslim power, pre-Muslim and non-Muslim power. It doesn't seem to have done very much, at least in the heartland of India, not on the margins, as you have richly shown as well in your earlier work, not in the Western Punjab, not in Eastern Bengal, where communities that were not Hindu in any sense to start with were sedentarized via Sufism, via the state, but also became Muslims. But in the heartland of, let's say Eastern Bengal and then westward and then Eastern Punjab eastward, Islam seems to have, at least elite Islam seems to have interacted with caste ecologies, much in the way that, non-Muslim power did. Would that be correct?
To begin with, I think this whole idea of Islam as an egalitarian religion needs to be somewhat more nuanced. It is certainly egalitarian with respect to one's relationship to God and to the transcendent reality. When you go to Mecca and circumambulate the Kaaba, everybody is wearing exactly the same white garb, and everybody is leveled down to equality. There are no distinctions of gender, of nationality, of language, of ethnicity, and so forth. But I think one needs to distinguish between egalitarianism before God, egalitarianism as a social reality, or I should say the lack of that is as a social reality. Muslims in India have historically been able to accommodate rather easily the idea of religious equality, but continued social inequality. I mean, you look at the use of the word baradari across North India. Of course, the word simply is a Persian word for brotherhood, but it functions in reality in many respects like caste, oftentimes, at least certainly in pre-modern India, defining communities according to issues of intermarriage or dining, not unlike traditional caste. So I think that really, to get to your question here, it starts from a flaw in assuming that egalitarianism embraces both social and religious equality, whereas I think we need to make a clear distinction between those two.
That's it's a useful distinction. And it's a distinction that echoes a distinction you make very early in your book between church and state. Of course, that is a distinction proper to Europe. But you say that, long before it was made in Europe, medieval Europe, it was made in Dar al-Islam, in the Islamic world. Presumably you have in mind the distinction between deen and dunya. Could you just tell us a little bit about just a few broad remarks, because it's a distinction that functions across many dynasties and across 1,000 years, not just in India, right? So how did Muslim kingship understand that distinction between a kind of a profane or secular realm where a religion-neutral justice was paramount, as opposed to a religious realm where there might have been hierarchies?
I'm very aware that when you say something about the separation of church and state, people immediately get alarmed because they assume that you're simply transposing European Enlightenment ideas onto India inappropriately. And I wish to say that's really not the case at all. That's not the intent. Because what I understand is going on here, and I became aware of this when I saw titles like the word sultan, or ruler, being adopted by non-Muslim kings, most famously in the Deccan plateau, but not confined to that. And many commentators in the 1990s, people like Hermann Kulka, I think it was, could not really accept the idea that it's true that these Hindus down in Bijapur could be calling themselves sultan. Well, that's what got me to think about this. Of course, they were using a Kannada or a Telugu version, Surathana, but it was the same word. And I asked myself, how could that be? And why is that? I'm trying to go beyond what Hermann Kulka was doing. And as I studied it more closely, I saw other things like the garb used by the kings of the south in Vijayanagara, the way the Persian language itself had infiltrated their own terms, their own languages. And So that the idea of the sultan became really something that had been effectively disengaged from Islam proper, something that was portable. It was an idea that could be accepted by most anyone who had aspirations to universal or all-powerful kingship. And it was a term, perhaps the most powerful term available in medieval India, to express this kind of aspiration. So the portability of the idea of sultan, indeed the portability of the idea of justice, which has very clear origins in the ancient Near East, goes all the way back to Mesopotamia. It's by no means exclusively Persian, but it was certainly part and parcel of the whole Mirror for Kings literature, which was imported into India right away in the 12th century, earlier actually. And these ideas diffused very rapidly, not only across sultanates of North India, but into the deep south of India, long before sultanate rule had ever actually ruled. So this takes me to the idea then of how the Persianate ideas and ideals were capable of being assimilated across political frontiers through a process of imitation and emulation. And it was precisely the secular dimension of the Persianate worldview, if you accept the word secular. It was precisely that made it so portable and so acceptable and so widely found in regions that we otherwise might think of as quote-unquote Hindu.
Having read your book, it strikes me that you focus largely on state formation at the intersection of individual actions, systems, and environment and economy, right? But to what extent was this a choice on your part? Or to what degree does it simply reflect the foci of the Persian and other Indian language archives and contemporary scholarship that mediate your understanding and that of other scholars? I ask this because I noticed that where we do see women, we see them with a few elite exceptions like Nur Jahan and Tarabai, who maneuver and manipulate a world of men and elite models of masculinity. We see them as items of exchange between men, as items of exchange in dynastic marriages between Rajputs and Mughals and so forth, right? Isn't this an effect of your focus on elite politics and culture? What would your book look like were you to tell a subaltern history of, say, non-urban peasants, which you do address partly when you speak of the military labor market, but again, in articulation with state power, right? Or women, were you to focus on, say, the history of women's history or peasant history, or indeed, for example, literary history, were you to focus on languages, or let's say the history of philosophy? The conclusion of your book, you speak of the permeability or osmosis between sciences, Sanskritic and Indic and Islamic sciences. What would it look like if you were to speak of interactions between Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit language philosophy? These are just thought experiments, right? Rather than mainly state formation.
I guess the short answer is, it's extraordinarily difficult to come away with a framework that is coherent and comprehensible when one is trying to talk about something as large as all of India and across, almost 1,000 years. So I had to make all kinds of choices. And I have been criticized in this book for focusing too much on top-down political narrative. And my answer to that is that, yes, I think I certainly do that. I'm guilty as charged. But I think that one needs to have some kind of framework within which to talk about social history. I mean, I was myself trained in social history, not political history, when I went to grad school myself. And I've been interested in non-elites all the time. But how you do that and how you bring that in something like 400-page book covering all this is a real challenge. So I made a choice to use a political framework precisely because I knew that this is a textbook. And as such, it will be approached by many people who probably know nothing about India and have never heard of the Khalji dynasty or of Vijayanagara or a lot of the other things that are so familiar to all of us. So I decided that out of necessity, I would use state formation and state systems as a framework because they at least are things that provide one with a starting point to think about larger questions. Now, I could have done other ways. I could have used philosophy or literary history. But I think that to do that might have ended up being more confusing for a textbook. Now, that's still, it's a valid point. You raised the question of women. I wish that I had talked more about women in there. In some of my previous work, I have discussed the role of non-elite village women in the diffusion of Islam, for example, in the Deccan plateau. I've talked about how the Chekinama, these poems that were written for recitation while women are grinding meal of some kind, whether it's wheat or rice or whatever it might be, or the charkhanama, the spinning wheel, and how these kinds of manual labor used by rural women were accommodated to Sufi understandings of transcendent reality, and how Sufi performance of zikr, for example, the recitation of the names of God and so forth, were accommodated to a village lifestyle. I did not talk about this in this book, and perhaps I should have, I guess. But these are the kinds of things that I had to leave out because I thought for the sake of introductory textbook, one still needs to have some kind of framework that will provide an easier way for people who are not familiar with Indian history to navigate their way through it all.
In relation to Sufism, you say on page 78, I'm going to quote, just as Sufi sheikhs associated with Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia had helped plant Delhi's authority in Bengal, disciples of those same sheikhs helped legitimate Ilyas Shah's rebellion against Delhi, unquote. This seems to be a feature of, as far as I know, all Sufi authority, apparently. One thinks of Abdul Quddus Gangohi, who declared his support for the Lodhis and then was made to, I think you say, walk 65 kilometers to Delhi as a punishment when the Mughals won, when Babur won. Or one thinks of Malik Muhammad Jaisi. One thinks much later of Bedil in his letters, which I recently wrote an essay on. One gets the sense that Bedil would have said the same sorts of things to Delhi's embattled Mughal elite, whether they lost or won, or whether they'd been supplanted by someone else. So my question is, what were Sufi understandings of statehood, so of state power? Was it merely a self-serving profession of loyalty to whichever was the winning side? Or was it a kind of a general investment in royal justice without a well-worked-out theory of state?
I've thought a great deal about the relationship between Sufis and state power. It seems to me that really what this comes down to is a fundamental conflict which is never resolved, and it's not resolvable, over the issue of sovereignty, which is to say, who ultimately is sovereign, legitimately sovereign? Is it the Sultan in his palace, gilded palace with lots of dazzle and tile work and surrounded by courtiers, and a snap of a finger he commands an army which can mow down a whole society? Or is it the person who is closer to God, which is the way Sufis would see themselves? And therefore, you have this tension between sultans, many of whom don't have a drop of pious blood in their body, as it were, and oftentimes no more than thugs who happen to be at the right time at the right place, and thereby come into power. But they are oftentimes legitimized by Sufis. And so this is fascinating. You get some Sufis who actually literally crown a new sultan as they're coming to the throne. And you have other Sufis who, of course, want to stay as far away from the court as possible. And so I think there's an inevitable tension between the magnetic power of the state, because after all, that's patronage. These kings can give you land. They can also give you access to influence. And I think many Sufis rationalized their closeness to the court on the grounds that they might be able to influence state policy in a way that would make the kingdom more pious. I'm thinking, for example, in Bijapur, there are some Sufis who approached the court with a view to dissuading Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah II from his veneration of the goddess Saraswati, which they thought was completely inappropriate. On the other hand, you have other Sufis who had nothing to do with state power, who stayed as far away as they could, geographically as well as politically. I mean, oftentimes, Chishti dargahs are very frequently located outside the walls of a sultanate, whereas those of some other orders, like the Qadris, are likely to be inside the walls, which tells you a great deal about that tension even between Sufi orders with respect to state power. So one can make perhaps a spectrum between those Sufis who rationalize closer to the court on the grounds that they might be able to influence the court, and who are accepted by the court because courts oftentimes have very little basis of legitimacy of their own, and who are more than eager to have popular Sufis on their side and visibly on their side. You think of the great shrines of many of the most prominent Sufis of India. These were not built by the fakirs themselves. Fakir means poverty. These people don't have all the money. They're built by the sultans. The Mughals, the Tughlaqs, and other dynasties were more than happy to foot the bill for paying for these massive dargahs, oftentimes because they wanted to be on the right side of popular figures in order to sink the roots of their own legitimacy deeper into the populace. So, yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating question, and I think it ultimately really comes down to the question of sovereignty, or who has the sovereignty. I mean, there are many stories in Sufi texts of how this or that saint appointed so-and-so to be the sultan, as if it was the Sufi who was the real sovereign, and he was simply allowing this thug to carry out the business of collecting revenue, organizing armies, and so forth, but that the sultan or the ruler only really ruled on behalf of the Sufi. And that is another trope that one finds constantly in Tazkarat literature, which is to say literature about the biographical literature of Sufis. That happens all the time. So in short, this is, I think, an irresolvable tension between Sufis and state power, ultimately having to do with the whole issue of sovereignty.
You say in your conclusion that among all spheres of culture, it was perhaps, I'm quoting you, perhaps in the sciences that knowledge passed most freely between the Persianate and the Sanskritic worlds. And it occurs to me, coming as this does at the end of your book, that perhaps what enabled, a kind of an enabling condition for this culture of respect for scholarly and to some extent religious difference was sacred kingship. In other words, the court of the sacred king functioned or seems to have functioned as a mediator or a common meeting ground. And was that perhaps because, as Aziz al-Azmeh showed in his book from some decades ago, Muslim Kingship, that Muslim kingship has always been syncretic, quite simply because the earliest Muslim kings in the Umayyad Caliphate necessarily had to cobble together or synthesize Sasanian and Byzantine royal and administrative practices, quite simply because the Prophet Muhammad himself came from a sparsely populated, partly nomadic peninsula where there were not robust traditions of kingship, which is to say that Muslim kingship at its very inception was syncretic, necessarily so. And that seems to have been, especially in its sacralized forms under the Mughals, a kind of, to use a modern metaphor, kind of a switchboard or a kind of, central mediating device by which culture was fostered of recognizing and learning from people who are different from yourself. Would that be correct, broadly?
Yes, I'd agree with that. The whole idea of Muslim kingship, of course, is basically a contradiction. In theory, there are no kings in Islam. So how do we then be Islamic and have kingship at the same time? This is precisely, of course, where the Sasanian and the Byzantine traditions were able to kind of step in and fill that gap. And this takes us into a huge other discussion, perhaps. And of course, when you get that kind of understanding of kingship, the Persianate one, you come into India, and this is another, I think, leitmotif of my book. I tried to make it anyway, to show how over time, these Persianate ideals and ideas of kingship become immersed in and borrowing of non-Muslim conceptions of rulership that everyone more or less has to subscribe to. And we find the whole history of the Mughal Empire certainly is a case of where you have a Central Asian understanding of the Badshah, which of course is what Babur brings with him to India. And you can see how Babur's understanding of kingship gets transformed over time as the Mughal Empire becomes progressively more indigenized. And this is carried over even, of course, by Aurangzeb, and we haven't talked much about him yet. But this is an idea, he's inherited this idea of Persian kingship and the whole idea of sacred kingship, something that Asfar Moin has talked about a great deal in his study. So basically, yes, what we see is a progression of styles and ideas of kingship that come to India. Already in the Samanid period, there's a very clear notion of a pre-Islamic Sasanian idea that comes in. But that in turn, by a process of accretion, gets expanded on and exploited in different ways. So I guess in sum, there is no single conception of Persian kingship that one has to conclude, but rather a tradition that evolves over time all the way down to the 19th century.
One of the key features of your account of Aurangzeb, both his biography and his legacies, is that he was, for you, a site of tension in a way between the model of sacred kingship that Akbar epitomized and a model of juridical kingship that he tried to revive or embody with varying degrees of success. You account for why he tried to do so and how he was disenchanted, even as a prince, by his bitter involvements in sacred kingship. But I had a larger question, not just specific to Aurangzeb, as a kind of concluding question. Would it be correct to say that the Islamophobia we see in India today is partly a product of sheer ignorance of what Hindu kingship must have been? Because the people at the top of the pyramid of power just before the British were the Mughals. And to someone wondering, well, what did it mean to be Hindu king? There seems to be almost no living memory of a Hindu king who didn't operate under the shadow of the Mughal Empire and of Islamic imperium in some sense, whether the sultanate system or whatever. What would you say, using Aurangzeb or otherwise, without referring to him, what would you say to someone who wondered today, what was Hindu kingship anywhere in India?
It seems to me there are many answers. There are many kind of Hindu notions of Hindu kingship across Indian history. But I think a way to start to answer that question is to think about, who were the people that Indian nationalists look back to in the late 19th century and the early 20th century when they had this idea of building an independent India. What would be the model for that independent India? And what's fascinating to me is you have two figures in particular come out. One is Krishna Raya of Vijayanagara, and the other is Shivaji, who were very different understandings of kingship, never mind Hindu kingship. And they are both, in a sense, distorted from the actual reality that I've been able to discern. For example, Krishna Raya himself, who has been elevated in recent times to Krishna Deva Raya, really was very much a traditional sultan in the way that he behaved, in the way that he perceived the state and state power, certainly in the way that he presented himself to the public in terms of his iconography. He wears a tall hat, which is called kulai in Telugu, based on the Persian word for headgear, kula. He wears a cloak, which is called another Telugu word, derived from the Arabic word kaba, or a tunic. And he builds architecture that is really straight out of the idea of the Chahal Satun, or the 40 columns palace hall that has a deep history all the way going back to Persepolis. In fact, when you go to Vijayanagara, to Hampi today, you see echoes of Persepolis all over the place. So this speaks to your question of precisely what was Hindu kingship. And I think that may be perhaps another misplaced question, because we're trying to, use a religious term, Hindu, talk about a style of kingship, which certainly Krishna Raya himself did not perceive as necessarily a religious category. It's what you do. If you want to be believed in as a universal ruler, if you want to have any credibility on the international stage as one who has power, you are going to build a Chahal Satun, where your ambassador from the Timurid court of Central Asia will come, and immediately he will recognize a certain sense of familiarity. That's part of the same world that he inhabits back in Herat or Samarkand. And so there's a great irony in the way in which 19th and 20th century Indian nationalists thought they were trying to revive a notion of a Hindu king. They really have to ask yourself what was really Hindu about it and what was really more Persianate about that notion. And the same thing could be said for Shivaji, I might add. So in summary, your question of this Islamophobia being a product of ignorance speaks directly to the point. I think if we knew more about this pre-British period of India's history, we would be less likely to carry this kind of a simple, reductive notion of Hindu kingship and have a much more capacious, more nuanced understanding of what India was really like on its own terms. So thank you very much for that question. That's a great question.
Prashant, thank you for posing such thoughtful questions and anchoring that rich discussion. And Richard, I can't thank you enough for that masterclass with unintuitive but really powerful narratives that fundamentally sort of redefine my and I think our understanding of medieval Indian history. I must say that my personal copy of India and the Persianate Age is on its way and being delivered, and I can't wait to read it. And I think our listeners might feel the same way. Thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks.
Thank you so much, Richard, for responding so richly, and congratulations again on wonderful book.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.